Welcome to Grief Out Loud, a podcast from Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families. I'm your host, Janet Cristofaro, and today we're diving into a conversation about sibling loss, a type of grief that often goes unrecognized and unsupported. My guest is Annie Sklaver Orenstein, author of Always A Sibling, The Forgotten Mourners. When Annie's older brother Ben was deployed to Afghanistan, she always kept her phone close, ready for his call. But when the news of his death came instead, Annie's world was turned upside down. In today's episode, Annie shares the impact of losing her brother, how grief intersected with anxiety, and what she's learned through writing her book, a resource she wished had existed when she was 25 and searching for support. We talk about the complexities of sibling grief, the weight of complicated relationships, and how Annie found unexpected comfort in being open to signs and other forms of connection with Ben. Before we get into it, I want to say something about my voice and the toll that grief can take on our bodies. When Annie and I recorded this episode back in December, I was about a week out from one of the worst bouts of the flu I've had in years. That first sickness hit about 4 days after my dog Captain died. A month later, it's time to record this introduction, and once again, I'm dealing with a virus, this time one that decided to take out my voice. It seemed only fitting that I sound as gravelly for this intro as I did in my conversation with Annie. So thanks for your patience with my vocal cords. Hopefully next time, I'll be free from whatever new crud is circulating. Okay, here's our conversation about grieving for a sibling. Annie, thanks so much for making time to be part of Grief Out Loud and for being very flexible with your schedule when I was down for the count with the flu and needed to reschedule. And listeners, yes, still recovering, but thank you, Annie, for making time.
I am very glad you're on the mend.
So let's start, as we always do, with the person or the people who kind of bring us into this conversation. So tell us a little bit about your older brother, Ben, and what kind of older brother he was.
So I'm the youngest of three. I have two older brothers. They are 4 and 8 years older. And Ben was the oldest. He was very much the oldest. You know, he was the one in charge. My mom would often joke that she raised 2 kids and then her 2 kids raised a third kid. You know, they really stepped up. My brother, I was born in June, and in, September, so I was 3 months old, my brother went back to 2nd grade and took me for show and tell. It was that was basically our relationship from then on. He was very much my protector. He made the world feel safe. He made me feel seen and worthy. As I was learning more about grief and about attachments in the research for the book, and I learned about kind of secure attachments, and I thought, oh yeah, that's what he was. He was, the person who I knew would always love me no matter what. Even when he was annoyed with me because I was being an annoying little sister, he loved me, and he loved that I was his annoying little sister. And as we got older, we just continued to get closer, and he was really, I think for both me and my middle brother, we really looked up to him, and he took his role as big brother very seriously. And he was good at it. He was really good at it. And I could call him with any problem, and I could, I went through a hard breakup, and he was living in Atlanta. I was in New York, and he bought me a plane ticket to come visit him for the weekend. And he had all of his friends ready to come by and cheer me up, and that was just very much who he was. And so, as a big brother, what kind of big brother was he? He was a really good one. He was a really good one who's and very loving, and it was unconditional love from him for as far back as I can remember.
It seems like a really engaged brother and also a really skilled caregiver in a way.
Yeah, and I think, when I think about it, I guess I hadn't really thought about this before until you said an engaged big brother. But, he went to college when I was 10 and he never moved back home. And in college, he spent a full year doing study abroad, and he traveled a lot for his work after that. And so, but yet, even though he wasn't living at home, he was always there. He was always present, wherever he was in the world. I could try to find him, or I could find him, and he was always available, right? If I called him when he was in college on a Saturday night because I was upset, he would talk to me. He wasn't always at home, but he was always present.
Which makes me think about when Ben died, he was living away, living overseas. Well, he wasn't living overseas, he was
Deployed, yeah.
deployed in Afghanistan. And well, first I wanted to know kind of like how you heard the news of his death, but then it's also making me think about this idea that even though he wasn't physically present, you could always connect with him. And then to have that sort of severing of, maybe I can still connect with him, but not in the same way.
Yeah, when he was deployed, we could email, and I think because he was the captain of the unit, he had a satellite phone. And so it was the kind of thing where like we couldn't call him, but he could call us. And so you just kept your phone with you and you kept your phone on, and it was any unknown number that comes in, you answer no matter what, because you never knew when it could be him. And he was very good at communicating. There was a lot, obviously, that he couldn't tell us, but like if he was going somewhere where he knew he wasn't going to have any kind of reception, he would email us first and say, I'm going to this place and I'm not going to have reception for the next 8 days. So if you don't hear from me, don't be surprised. He was very good at communicating that kind of stuff. And I think he would always remind us and tell us, like, no news is good news, right? If you haven't heard from me, it's probably because I am in a place that has no reception. I don't, I can't get to a computer or whatever. No news is good news. No news is good news. And I struggled with that because I really am an over communicator. I want all of the news. And I also, my imagination can sometimes get the worst of me. And so if there's silence, I assume the worst. But when that day came, I realized that what he had said was very true, because, the day he was killed, and I don't know what the time difference is to Afghanistan, but the day he was killed, there were soldiers on my parents' front porch waiting for them. There was no time lost. It was, there is bad news and it comes quickly. They find you. My parents got the news first. I was actually at my brother Sam's apartment. I was babysitting his son, who was a year old. And I was babysitting so they could go out for a movie. My parents called Sam and they told him what happened. They said they were going to drive into the city and come tell me, because at that point I had been living alone in Manhattan, and they did not want me to get the news when I was alone. They, I guess, were going to drive, the 2 hours into New York and find me and tell me. And Sam said, well, she's sitting on my couch, so I will go tell her. And I remember I was waiting for food delivery. The door opened, and my first thought was, I can't believe this sushi delivery guy has their key. Like, I thought, like, first of all, Annie, like, safety. I mean, what were you thinking? But I was just like, oh, cool, I guess sushi's here, and they bring it right in. And I looked over and Sam and Wendy were standing there, and I just thought, like, they weren't okay. They clearly were not okay. And so I thought maybe they had gotten in a big fight or something like that. And I stood up to walk over to them, and they kind of sandwiched me in a hug on both sides. And I said, is everything okay? And Sam said, no, it's Ben. And I said, but everything's okay. And he said, no, it's Ben. And it like kept, it was like that, and he said, Ben died. Oh, man. Normally I could tell the story fine, but something about today, I think they kind of walked me over to the couch. I don't really know how I got to the couch. And I just remember sitting on the couch and kind of rocking back and forth and saying, like, this wasn't supposed to happen. No, this can't be. This wasn't supposed to happen. And that was it, that was a Friday. And on Saturday, his body was returned to the States. They flew him back, which I think was faster than is typical. We are Jewish, and so we don't embalm. There's the bodies, Jews don't embalm. And so when there's no preserving of the body, you need to bury it quickly. It's why Jewish funerals typically happen, 48 hours after the death. And so they got him home. They got him home really fast. Those first few days, everything moved really fast, and then everything moved in slow motion for a while.
Annie, what stood out to me is how clear your memories are in the lead up to getting the news of Ben's death. And I'm curious, does that clarity continue after, or do things get real hazy?
Oh, I remember next to nothing. It's like flash bulbs for months after. When I started working on the book, I talked to Ben's best friends. I was talking to his best friend, Kevin, and Kevin was talking about being, so the way it works, the body was returned to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Then they transferred it to a smaller, carrier plane. They flew it up to the Tweed, which is a local airport in New Haven that at the time was only for like private use. I'd never been there before. And so we waited on the tarmac at Tweed for the body to, for the plane to arrive and for the casket to be transferred to the hearse. My brother's best friend, Kevin, was talking about being at Tweed that night. And I have no recollection of him being there. And, he said he was standing behind us, and he talked about the sound that our mom made when the coffin was unloaded. And I don't remember that at all. And there's so much that is just, I have these flashbulbs. I remember like moments of Shiva, and I remember kind of moments in the weeks that follow. But overall, I remember very little.
And Annie, you were 25 when Ben
Yes.
died.
Mm-hmm.
And what did 25-year-old Annie know or think she knew about what grief was and what it was going to look like?
At that point, let me think, I had lost 3 grandparents and an uncle. And so I knew grief, but I knew grief, my grandparents were all in their 90s. And so it was different. I had been convinced that Ben was not going to make it home from Afghanistan. I had been convinced that he was going to die. And I was the catastrophizer in the family. And then when he died, I thought, this was not supposed to happen. This is all wrong. This was not supposed to happen. And what I realized was that I was convinced that something bad was going to happen. But I am often convinced that something bad is going to happen because I now know that I have OCD and it manifests as intrusive thoughts. I didn't know that then, but what I knew at least is that I had these fears quite often, I always thought the worst thing was going to happen, but then the worst thing never did happen. So I was always wrong. So, like, even though I was convinced that something bad was going to happen, I think subconsciously I assumed I'd be wrong, that this would be another case of like Annie catastrophizing. And when it happened, it suddenly felt like this was all off. This is not actually what was supposed to happen. I think, truthfully, 25-year-old Annie didn't know shit about grief. I, I've never experienced anything like it. And I don't think it's something that you can understand unless you have felt it, because it's beyond anything that I had imagined, and it affected me in ways that I could not have imagined.
I was thinking as you were talking about in the grief world, there's a lot of the talk of like the loss of the assumptive world and shattered assumptions. Most time people hear that and they think that good things happen to good people or some of those assumptions. But I was like, oh, Annie's assumption was I can trust my worst case scenario catastrophizing to not happen, even though it's very strong in my head. And then it happened. And then that whole sense of meaning in the world got broken apart for you.
Right. And suddenly, it was like, okay, usually I have these terrible worst fears and they don't come true. But now they did come true. And so then it made it a lot harder to deal with those same kind of intrusive thoughts moving forward, because suddenly I couldn't trust that I would be wrong or that I was being irrational, And again, I didn't have the language to know what intrusive thoughts were or what was actually happening, but suddenly all of my fears felt very real. And it felt like, well, if this guy he was untouchable, he's gone, and that fear came true. And so it made all of my fears feel even more valid, I guess. And it made it a lot harder for me to convince myself that these were irrational fears and that these weren't really going to happen, because, well, you know what? I was right last time. So maybe I am right this time. And I didn't want to be right, but it became very difficult to trust that anything was going to be okay.
So I'm going to take a wild guess that anxiety played a role in your grief.
Correct. That would be correct.
Maybe a starring role.
Perhaps. And it definitely reared its ugly head. And at times, like, as I hit different milestones in my life, where it would get, better and worse. And he was like, there were times where, like, oh, great, now a new fear has been unlocked. When I had my son, who's my older child, and it was 6 years later, but suddenly I remember sitting on my couch, like when we brought him home from the hospital, and looking at him and looking at my mom and thinking, she lost her firstborn son, and now I have this firstborn son. She lost her Archie, and now I'm going to lose my Archie. And I just remember crying and saying to her, like, I'm so sorry you lost your Archie. Because I'm looking at this baby and thinking, she lost her baby, but then I kind of convinced myself that if my mom lost her firstborn son, I was going to lose my firstborn son. And I had postpartum anxiety. Again, it felt like a foregone conclusion. I didn't wonder whether or not I was going to lose him. I just knew I would. I just didn't know when it would happen. And I remember my therapist saying, like, your brother was killed in an active war zone. You live in Brooklyn. Your son is a toddler in Brooklyn. And I was like, what's your point? None of that is relevant. Like, you're trying to logic this away. This is not logic. Logic is not what got us into this.
Feel free to throw that into the bonfire of grief.
Yeah,
where it doesn't.
Exactly. Like, you're trying to battle grief and intrusive thoughts and postpartum anxiety with logic? Like, good luck. Yeah.
So, Annie, one of the reasons we connected is because of your book, Always a Sibling, which really, it seems like that book kind of came out of you being 25-year-old Annie looking around and being like, where's anything for me? Like, where's the books? Where are the podcasts? Where are the support groups for adult siblings who are grieving their sibling? And so I'd love to hear kind of like how you came to write your book, Always a Sibling.
When I was approaching the 10-year anniversary of Ben's death, I really I wanted to do something. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I needed to do something. And there were two things that I kind of knew I needed to do. And one was that he was a very avid journaler. He had a lot of journals that none of us had opened and none of us had read. They had been sitting in my parents' house. Approaching the 10-year anniversary, I knew I needed to do something. And he had all of these diaries that were at my parents' house that we had not read. I started there. I decided to read those. And the other thing I wanted to do was reconnect with his friends and people who knew parts of his life that I didn't know. Again, I was 8 years younger. So I wanted to talk to the best friends from high school and the guys from the army and people like that, because I was desperate for a new memory. When you lose someone, you lose any opportunity for a new memory. And I had been just replaying these memories that I had in my head for 10 years. And I just wanted a new memory, and I also knew that I was starting to forget things. And I felt like if I don't do this now, then these other people who hold the memories might forget them if they haven't already. And so I thought, I'm just going to start by collecting all of these memories. I'm a researcher by training, by trade. I'm a qualitative researcher, and interviewing people about difficult things is what I do. So I thought that's how I will start. And I'm going to do these interviews. My brother Sam, when I was doing this, kept saying, like, this sounds like a podcast. And I was like, I know, but I don't think it is. I don't know why. Maybe because I don't know how to make podcasts, and I don't know how to edit, and I don't know how to do any of that stuff. I do think the interviews could actually make a good podcast, but at the time I was like, that doesn't feel right. And my favorite book is this book called Rant by Chuck Palahniuk. I feel like no one's ever read it, but it's really good. And it's written as an oral history. So I decided I was going to write a book about Ben that would be written through like his diary entries and these interviews written as like an oral history with his diary entries in there. So that was the first proposal I wrote, and I took it out to agents and didn't really hear back from anyone. And then I wrote a piece that got into Time magazine about Ben and about, reading the diaries for the first time in 10 years. And after that, I heard from an agent, and she said, this was really good. You're in this, but you're not in the proposal. Would you be willing to do a version of the proposal where you are in the story and it's more about, you and Ben? And after some consideration, I said yes. And then feedback we got on that from publishers was, you're right that we need a book about sibling grief. Would you be willing to write one that's more broadly about sibling grief? Not as memoir, but more as nonfiction, like a prescriptive nonfiction. And when I heard prescriptive nonfiction, I remember saying to my agent, like, do they want me to write a book on like 10 ways to get over your dead brother? Because if so, I'm not the girl. I'm not going to write that. And at the time, I hadn't really read any grief books that helped me, because I tried one or two right when Ben died. They were not helpful. And then I never opened another one again. But I kept thinking about how I really needed that book. I looked for that book. I looked for a book about sibling loss. I couldn't find it. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, what if I wrote the book that 25-year-old Annie needed? Could I do that? And what I knew is that the only thing I could write about with confidence was, the loss of a sibling you're close to, sibling you had a really good, healthy relationship with, a sibling who died, kind of tragically in this violent way, but in this way that was really kind of celebrated by our culture, right? Everyone came out for him. People were out on the street when we were driving by from the synagogue to the cemetery. And like, that doesn't happen when someone dies from addiction or mental health, right? And so I couldn't write to those experiences, but I could interview and I could research. That was what I knew how to do. So I came back and said, okay, I can do this, but this is how it would work. It wouldn't just be me writing this book. I want to do this research and, survey and do these interviews. And that's how I can write to a more universal experience. And it's not going to be 10 ways to get over your dead brother. It's going to be different than that. And during that time, I also started reading more grief books and, recent grief books that I did find really helpful. And that also made me feel like, okay, I can do this. And I want to be a part of this. But it was definitely a windy journey to get there. And when I first started thinking about this project, it was very different than how it ended up.
What I really appreciated about your book is the way you weave together your personal memoir sections. Ben comes through so clearly, all the voices of all the people that you interviewed, and then some just like concrete information about grief and putting it sometimes in a more historical, social context. And that made me wonder, after you wrote your book and you looked back over it a gazillion times, which section of your book do you think you needed most when Ben first died?
Ooh, when Ben first died?
Or anytime. You could pick a time period.
Well, I will say that the Mr. McGorium's Wonder Emporium chapter, which was about radical acceptance, that chapter changed significantly because I had a breakthrough while writing the book. And I think it was a breakthrough that I needed. But like, if you look at how I describe that chapter in the proposal and then how it actually is, it is wildly different because I had a conversation while researching it that completely changed my perspective on radical acceptance and what that means. Maybe not in the first, weeks or months, but pretty early on, I could have really used the chapter on signs because I did not believe any of that at all. It took me a really long time to come around to that and to open myself up to that. That time that I spent resisting it was very lonely. And the best way to describe it is that for a long time, it felt like there was just a Ben-shaped hole. This Ben-shaped hole in my heart that I didn't want to close necessarily because it felt like that Ben-shaped hole was all I had left. And so I was clinging to it, but it was his absence. That hole was his absence. And once I started being, opening up to signs and seeing pieces of him in my everyday life and, feeling his presence more, it was like that hole, it didn't shrink, but it started to be filled with things. It was filled with these memories of different times when I felt his presence and things that made me laugh and, ways in which it felt like he was still a part of my life. And those started to fill the hole so that it didn't feel like a void anymore. It didn't feel like I was carrying around a void. It felt like I was carrying around a little pocket Ben in my heart, and instead of carrying around his absence in my heart, I was carrying around his presence in my heart. And I don't know, maybe there's no way I could have felt that earlier, but I really wish that I could have. I wish that 10 years ago I could have felt that because I think it would have saved me a lot of pain and anguish, to feel like he was still around in some small way, or that I still carried a piece of him.
Is there a recent example of one of those connection points with Ben?
They happen a lot now, and they happen a lot in like very small ways. It's always through music. It happened the day that I guess this isn't that recent, a year ago, but the day that I submitted like the final edits to the manuscript, I was going to an Indigo Girls concert. And I love Indigo Girls, and they were one of his favorite bands. So I knew it was going to be meaningful in that way. But I got there, and it was just like, sign, 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 like beating me over the head. It was like, we walk in, go to the merch table. I wanted something to commemorate this day. I had just submitted my manuscript, and the merch, the t-shirt, the front of the t-shirt was a library card, and the back of the t-shirt was a bookshelf covered in books. And then, then they start with this song, Howl at the Moon, that's like a real deep cut. It's not one of their most popular ones. And the opening line is, "Oh, Annie, I am sorry for your grief. Younger sister to my lover, I know you'd both rather be on the roads in Michigan." Like, so that plays first. I'm bawling. Then they play Power of Two, which was his favorite song and the working title of my book for a while, where, in Power of Two, they have that line, if I ever leave a legacy, it's that we loved each other well. Mm-hmm. And, all about the power. So then I'm like legit, like crying to the point where I was like, this is not fun. And my friends who I'm with are just, at this point, are just like, this is fucking crazy. Like the hits just kept coming, And I was like, they need to play something else after this, because like I cannot. And I remember like looking up and being like, Ben, I get it. I see the signs. I get it. You're here. You're very excited. I too am very excited. You need to give me a little break so I can get it together, And I like literally said that out loud, and my friends are all laughing. But there have absolutely been times like that where I'm like, okay, I know that it took me a while to see the signs in the first place, but now I see them, and you don't need to hit so hard.
Like, turn the fire hose down.
Yes, it like reminds me of when I was like, when I was a kid and I had these two big brothers, like physically very big brothers. They would say things like, we're going to teach you how to punch. It's important that you know how to punch. And I'd be like, okay, this is how you do it. And then they'd each punch me in one arm, and I'd have two dead arms. And then that, and it was like that. It was like just like a dead arm of signs. And sometimes they're smaller, sometimes it's a song that comes on the radio or something like that. But so, yeah, sometimes it's a big one. That was a big one.
Well, Annie, as we are coming towards the end of our interview time together, I have a big question for you to answer in a short period of time, which is, you and Ben had this very secure, loving connection, and you were grieving his death from that relationship. And then in your research for your book, you talked to hundreds of other people who had very different kinds of relationships with their siblings. And I was curious what you've come to learn and understand about what it's like to grieve for a sibling when the relationship was complicated in some way, maybe from estrangement or a history of conflict or substance use, mental health, those different kinds of layers.
I have learned a lot. The first survey I sent out, I had, a question early on that was like, tell me about your relationship with your sibling. And I remember very clearly there was one response that was like, if she wasn't my sister, we wouldn't be friends. We just were never very close. We didn't have a lot in common. Like kind of like an indifference vibe. And then later in the survey, it says, what was the experience of losing the sibling like for you when they passed? And this same woman responded like, it was, devastating. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to me. It felt like I lost a limb. It felt like I couldn't breathe for months. And I was confused because, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a mental health professional. And I was like, these two feel like they are at odds with each other. How can you say, if we weren't sisters, we wouldn't be friends? And then, then say it was this worst thing that ever happened to me. And something that I learned throughout the research was that how close the relationship doesn't actually necessarily, if you weren't as close, it doesn't mean you're not going to grieve as much. And sometimes, I think a big thing I learned is like, we still grieve imperfect people and we grieve imperfect relationships. And sometimes it is those relationships that weren't as close or, weren't as healthy that are even harder to process, because for a lot of those folks who I talk to, either there's trauma layered on top of their grief, which complicates everything, or there was a feeling like, we weren't that close, but this is my sister. They're going to be in my life for forever. And maybe we'll get close. Maybe when we're adults, we'll get close. Maybe once we all have kids, we'll get close. So there were a lot of people who were kind of holding out hope. They were still, and even with estrangement, right? We were estranged at the time of his death, but I always thought we would get over it and, we would have a relationship again. And so you're not only grieving that person, but you're grieving this future relationship that you thought you were going to have. And you are oftentimes regretting that you were estranged or that you didn't form that, you didn't get close sooner. And so it gets even more complicated. That was really interesting to me as someone who has not experienced those things firsthand. It certainly made me very glad that I had done the research and the interviews, because it wasn't something I ever could have written to, and I probably would have written something all wrong. But they taught me a lot about those more complex relationships, and that they deserve to be grieved, and often require, a lot of like understanding and deep nuance.
And I know one of the things I come across often in the work that I do is there's a lack, or there can be this perceived lack of permission, both for the person who's grieving and coming from other folks. And so even not more important to provide support, but it's so important to have it on the radar that folks who had a complicated relationship may have a lot of obstacles to even accessing their own reaction to the loss.
And siblings are the only type of familial loss where if someone, finds out that you lost a sibling, their first question will be, were you close? And that's the permission piece. It's as if the answer to the question, were you close, will determine whether or not you are allowed to grieve. If you weren't close, then there's really no reason why you should be grieving, and I'm not going to give you that space or sympathy. No one asks you that if you've lost a parent or a spouse or a child, but they do when you lost a sibling. And it really feels like that they are determining if you are allowed to grieve. And I think it's a terrible question, obviously, but it does feel like there's a lot of judgment around whether or not you're allowed to grieve your sibling.
I always hear that too, is depending on which answer you give me, I know how hard I have to work to maybe show up for you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I can let myself off the hook a little bit. If you say you weren't close, then okay, phew, I don't have to do as much as maybe I was thinking I was going to have to do to support you.
Right, exactly.
Well, Annie, thank you for that reminder that sometimes these very commonplace and not poorly intentioned questions can just land with a lot of friction for folks. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, Annie, I've so enjoyed our time together today. I enjoyed my time listening to and parallel reading your book, which is my new favorite thing to do, hear you in stereo. Anything you want listeners to know about how to connect with you, where to find your book.
Yes. You can find my book, Always a Sibling, The Forgotten Mourner's Guide to Grief, is available anywhere books are sold. Bookshop.org, Amazon, your local bookstore, anywhere. And I am on Instagram at Annie Sklaver Orenstein.
Well, Annie, thank you again for making time during a very busy end of the year to have this conversation with me for Grief Out Loud. I really enjoyed our time together.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners out there, each and every time I say it to you, thank you for being part of the show, the listening community, for making the show mean what it does. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. It's dougy.org. It's also our main website where you'll find information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. I'm always excited to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Grief Out Loud is a production of Ducky Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.